Flex instructors at Positive Spin. I just wanted to make a little video because I feel like the whole fitness industry is obviously wildly misunderstood and full of misconceptions. But flexibility, I feel like, is particularly unquestioned in terms of how do we train it, why is it important? Lots of people don't know. And so we get a lot of people saying, why would I take flex class? Maybe they say, I'm not flexible at all, so that class is not for me, which is not true. You don't have to be flexible to take flex class. You don't even have to be particularly flexible to be a flexibility instructor. Because flexibility is good for a lot more than just achieving dramatic, bendy, impressive shapes. If your goal is to impress your friends, it will actually help you quite a bit with that as well. But if your goal is to be able to keep dancing, keep training, keep doing what you love, and not be in pain, flex class is also for you. Some people will also say, I'm already very flexible, why would I come to flex class? And we don't have time to go into like all of the complicated reasons that some people are naturally flexible while others are not, but the very short answer is people who are naturally flexible often experience flexibility in their joints, and it allows for really big range of motion. However, it doesn't allow for a lot of support in those ranges of motion. It actually makes you more prone to injuries. So we spend a lot of time in flex class learning how to make our muscles more strong in bigger ranges so that we stay safe, whether we are naturally flexible and hoping not to injure ourselves and make that flexibility more functional, or whether we're like very stiff, not bendy at all. The same techniques are gonna help. So today's video, we're gonna dive into like one little piece of what this might look like and how this might be useful to that. And we're only gonna hit the tip of the iceberg, but that piece is gonna be preventing lower back pain, whether that lower back pain comes from doing bendy tricks, doing pull tricks, or whether that pain just comes from living your daily life. Tons of people live with low back pain, and unfortunately, I personally, when I used to experience this on a regular basis, was not able to receive good medical treatment around it. It really impacted my training and my day-to-day life. And so the theory I use in my flex class comes from a lot of personal experience, trial and error, and working with a lot of really brilliant, intelligent, like industry leaders who have kind of figured out the secrets to solving low back pain and not having to suffer from it all the time. So we're really going to hit on two elements that contribute to whether or not we experience low back pain. Those are going to be core engagement and hip extension. Now we're going to start with core engagement. When you think of core engagement or ab strength, you might think of crunches. That's kind of the go-to. There's nothing wrong with crunches. I do them sometimes, but they don't get all of our ab muscles on board. They don't get all the stabilizers. They don't get the lowest part of your core. And those are all going to be really important to stabilizing through back bends, through pull tricks, and also just through supporting our low backs to day-to-day existing. And so we're going to dive into this drill with really specific attention to detail. It's not a big flashy drill by any means. We spend a lot of time in flex class doing really teeny tiny detail things that are going to be really helpful but don't always look impressive. We get to the impressive stuff at the end of class. So, anyways, we're going to come onto our backs, knees stack above the hips in this tabletop position, so my knees are bent at 90 degrees, my feet are off the floor. And then you may have heard the cue if you've done core workouts in the past of press your low back into the floor. That's a good starting point, but I like to take it a step further. And I like to find the bottom of my rib cage here and the top of my pelvis, and I think about drawing them in towards each other. So much so that maybe it almost feels like your butt's gonna lift off the floor. It's not gonna go very far or anything, but if you feel that tiny bit of lift, that's a good sign. So I'm crunching my bottom ribs and my hips towards each other, and I'm thinking about like my abdomen flattening out to the sides. And the combination of those two things, you should already feel a lot of work happening there. I personally like to use my fingers to measure the distance between my bottom ribs and the top of my hips. It should be quite small, and I just keep my fingers there to make sure that my torso doesn't lengthen through this process. And then I'm going to take one leg and I'm going to drop that leg towards the floor,
it's going to feel tempting to let that side of your abdomen lengthen. I'm gonna keep the crunch as I pull that leg back up, and then switch sides. So whichever leg is dropping, you're gonna be extra careful not to let that side of your torso lengthen, and that's what the fingers are for. You can alternate here. Another thing to keep in mind is it does not matter if you reach the floor. I would rather that you keep the crunch and maybe you're only going halfway. Be mindful of whether or not your heel is coming in towards your butt as you lower. That makes it much easier to reach the floor. I would kind of prefer that you keep your knees at 90 degrees, even if you're only getting halfway to the floor, totally fine. And so I try to keep that angle of my legs regardless how far I am getting to the floor each day. You can do about 5 to 10 on each side, depending on how difficult this is for you.
The next piece that we're gonna go over is hip extension. So as humans, we spend most of our time in what's called hip flexion. I'm in hip flexion right now, and you can tell because my knees are in front of my hip joint. Now this is like a very easy to see example of hip flexion. You can tell, especially from the side, my knees are quite far in front of my hip joints. I am pretty far into hip flexion. And as humans, some of us spend all of our time in hip flexion, particularly those of us who have a certain position of our pelvis where it naturally sits. And I am one of these people, so in my experience, it is about half of people. That's not a scientific statistic, that's just my observation over my years of working with many different bodies. My pelvis rests in what's called hyperlordosis, which means I have a little bit of extra curve in my low back. My pelvis sits in an anterior pelvic tilt, slightly tipped forward. You don't need to memorize these big words if you don't want to, but all it really means is my pelvis tips forward. I have a little bit of arch in my low back. It's not inherently a bad thing to stand that way if that's how your body naturally stands. Don't try to like overcorrect it in your day-to-day life. Let your body stand how those bones naturally sit. However, you'd see because, and I'll exaggerate a little bit, because my pelvis is tipped this direction, my hip joint is actually very slightly behind my knees just when I'm standing or even laying down oftentimes. That's okay, however, it does mean that if I don't intentionally spend some time working on hip extension, certain muscles never get stretched or strengthened in certain ranges, and that is a huge cause of low back pain for so many people. And unfortunately, even in like the medical community, I find that a lot of people haven't yet learned how to really cope with that and intervene in a way to prevent or end that particular suffering that I struggled with for many years. So these techniques for me come from my own personal experience, working with tons of industry experts who have gone through this themselves and helped others through this, and kind of compiling knowledge to find a system that has worked for myself and so many of my students. So what is hip extension? Hip extension is when your hips come actually a little bit in front of your knees. As humans, we don't have very much range. Even if you're the bendiest hip person in the world, we cannot like sit backwards the way I'm now sitting forwards. I will never be able to fold that direction. That's okay. However, a little bit goes a long way. So in order to come into hip extension, let's pop up onto our knees. Feel free to add some cushions under your knees if they're feeling sensitive. Hip extension often gets confused with low back bending, and doing too much low back bending without the support of hip extension can make your back bends worse. So the first thing we're going to do is kind of disable our back bend in this drill, and we're going to use the same technique that we used to engage our core before. You're going to find those bottom ribs, find the top of your pelvis, crunch them towards each other. We're going to keep that. It kind of scoops your hips under, and in this position I always feel like my belly button is trying to look up my nostrils. Now from here, I'm going to keep that crunch. I'm going to squeeze my butt cheeks together and push them through my hips. You'll notice your hips shifting just ever so slightly forward, and you should start to feel a little stretch here in your hip flexors. And then keeping this crunch, go ahead and lean back with that whole upper body. And then use those glutes to pop forward. So we will lean back, pop forward. Now you're gonna feel feelings in your quads. One of your quads is a hip flexor, so very normal to feel there. but the more you tuck your hips, the more you'll feel higher up.
We're gonna go over one more exercise in this video for our hip flexors. So many people don't know how to stretch their hip flexors, or at least not all of them. They end up stretching their low back or only their quads, and one of your quads is a hip flexor. And so when you're doing hip flexor stretches, you generally will feel a lot in your quad. That's great, but we wanna hit those other muscles as well. I find that this particular drill is a nice, accessible way for most people to start feeling those other hip flexor muscles, because it can be hard to find at first if you've never stretched your hips before. So for this drill, we're gonna need a wall. And you're gonna set yourself up on your forearms and knees at the wall. So you're gonna have toes to the wall, knees on the floor, forearms on the floor, and then you're gonna take one leg and you're gonna squeeze your glute and send that leg as high up the wall as you can. So I have my toes pointed, I can scoop my forearms in, and then I'm gonna bend that leg so that my knee touches the wall. Now here, you may already start to feel a bit of a hip stretch, but what I want you to do to intensify it, keep that knee on the wall, but look down and back for the bottom of the wall and round your back, push, and squeeze that glute of that top leg through the hip, and you should feel a nice stretch right through here. And I would say just go ahead and hold this for 30 seconds to a minute on each side, trying to round through that back, especially your low back. You'll round your whole back, but think about tucking that pelvis under, creating that roundness in the low back. There's so many more ways to stretch your hip flexors and use drills to keep your body feeling healthy and good. So if you want more, we go over all sorts of stuff and much more in-depth ways of thinking about this in our flexibility classes. Would love to see you there.